Let's look at absolute value equations and inequalities. So the big idea with absolute value is that it is the distance from zero. So if we're looking at absolute value of some number as 4, well, we could go 4 units in the positive direction, or we could go 4 units in the negative direction. So there's going to be two cases, a positive and a negative for absolute value. So when we have more complicated equation with absolute value, the first step is to isolate the absolute. Alright, so we would get 2 times the absolute value of x minus 4 is equal to 6, and then you can just divide through by 2. So now I have succeeded in isolating the absolute value. The next step is to write two cases. And we'll have a positive, so whatever's in that absolute value will be a positive 3, so you take the positive of that number, and then you also take the second case would be the negative of that number, just like we did up here where we had the number inside the absolute value, this x, could be a positive or a negative 4. Okay, so we need to set up that same situation here. It's just that now it's not just plain old x, it's x minus 4. And then just solve that equation. So you've got x equals 7 and x equals 1. Okay, so the big idea, isolate your absolute value and then write your two cases. Great, and those do check out, and so the two cases are going to always be, just like we had here, we had a positive and a negative. So those are the two cases. You've got the positive of this value 3, and the negative is that second case. All right, so now, here if somebody's trying to sell you this idea that the absolute value of something x plus 2 is equal to a negative number, not possible. Absolute value is a distance from 0, which distance is positive. So this is not possible to have the absolute value equal negative. So this one is no solution. You could also write that as the empty set. And students get confused because this equation right here has no solution, but then they say, well, look, there's a negative right here. Okay, the difference is this equation has absolute value sign, so this is saying the distance from 0 right in here is a negative number, which doesn't make sense. Notice there's no absolute value in here. I've rewritten an absolute value into two cases, 1 and 2 cases. So this is not talking about absolute value anymore. All right, let's look at, does it make sense to have a distance from 0 be 0? Yeah, we could have 0 units away from 0. In that case, x would be negative 2. And that would check out, right? Negative 2 plus 2, the absolute value of that is 0. Okay, so that one is fine. And now sometimes you'll have an absolute value is equal to another absolute value. And those ones we get to just set up with the same two cases. We've already isolated one of those absolute values. So we would take our two cases would be 3x minus 5 is equal to x plus 5. And then our second case would be 3x minus 1 is equal to the negative of whatever's inside this absolute value. The second case would be negative of that value. So we would put x plus 5 in there and then distribute your negative. And then we can keep going and solving. Here we would get negative x minus 5. Get all my x's on one side. So I'd get 4x minus 1 equals 5. And then adding, well, that's the negative 5. Adding 1 to both sides, we would get 4x is equal to negative 1, or negative 4. So x equals negative 1. And then over here, I can get all my numbers on one side. So I've got 3x is equal to x plus 6. And then I would get 2x equals 6, so x equals 3. And then we can make sure that those really work. Go ahead and check. All right, and we can see that those do work. The biggest mistake is on these that people want to change the sign on what you're putting into the left side, but notice on all of these, everything on the left remains the same as what was given. Okay, so always what's in the left is still the same. The thing that's changing is what is on the right side of the equation. You've got two cases, positive of whatever's given on the right and negative of whatever's given on the right. And that's done. All right, in the next video, I'll show how to solve the inequalities.